The eagle-eyed among you may notice a little bit of a disconnect here. I'm out here in the forest reviewing Jeep's all-new desert-rated pickup truck, the new 2020 Gladiator Mojave. The reason for that is that unfortunately, due to the ongoing pandemonium in the world, the launch event for this vehicle was canceled and I was not able to drive this out on some sand dunes, and for that I am bitterly disappointed. As a result, this video is going to be a little bit shorter than normal, a little bit different as well. We're going to talk about the differences between the Mojave and the other trims of the Jeep Gladiator, which model might be right for you, and then hopefully at a later date when I can get this out in the desert, we'll have a separate video focused on that. The main reason for that is that there are a lot of touches to the Mojave that I just can't honestly test out here in the woods. Out here in the forest, if you wanted to go truly off the trail, that's where the Gladiator Rubicon would come in. There was a time in America, and I'm talking decades ago, where off-road vehicles were a little bit of factory design and a little bit of homebrew. You went to the dealer, you bought a Jeep Wrangler, and then you heavily modified it yourself at home. Quite logically, those modifications tended to be very personal because they depended on what kind of off-roading you were interested in. Were you interested in dune jumping? Were you going to be rock crawling? Are you going to be mud bogging? Those all require different modifications to the base vehicle. Then manufacturers like Jeep realized, hey, why don't we get in on this business and create focused versions of our vehicles for these various situations? And that's certainly what we see in the Jeep lineup and now for the Jeep Gladiator as well. The Rubicon model is certainly targeted at more aggressive off-roading, especially rock crawling and higher obstacle clearance. So we have the bumper available with the removable sections in the front. We don't find that for some reason in the Mojave. That gives you slightly better front ground clearance. If you wanted to try and climb over a big rock there, you'd be able to do that without hitting the bumper. Then of course we have more luxury-oriented Jeep models. We have the 4-door Jeep Wrangler. We have the Jeep Gladiator pickup truck for someone that wants to haul some gear and do some off-roading. And then into this comes the all-new Mojave, the first desert-rated Jeep. You can definitely expect there to be more desert-rated Jeeps coming up soon. The orange tow hooks are the biggest visual difference up front. If you look a little bit more closely, you'll notice that the front end has been lifted ever so slightly. It's a 1-inch lift up front, no lift in the rear, and it does not affect the overall ground clearance of the vehicle. That was to help incorporate some of the additional suspension components that we find up front that are specifically targeted at desert running. Now versus the Wrangler lineup, you'll notice that the front end is a little bit different. This is not the same grille that we find in the Wrangler or the Wrangler 4-door, and that's because of the cooling demands for the Gladiator. As you'd expect, Jeep didn't just give this orange tow hooks and call it a day. Instead, they did some major structural changes, and then of course they rooted around in the parts bin and found components that were already in use in other vehicles, but would be more appropriate for a desert-focused vehicle like the Mojave. So we get a frame that is strengthened in key locations versus the rest of the Gladiator lineup. That is unique to the Mojave trim. Then we get strengthened front suspension components, unique front suspension tuning, unique dampers. These are 2.5-inch dampers with remote reservoirs that are located right there under the front bumper area. And because when desert running, there's a decent possibility that you'll be bottoming out your suspension now and then, they replaced the rubber stops up front with hydraulic bump stops. The engineers pulled out the widest front axle they had available and then stuck on some 33-inch tires. Out back we find another set of orange hooks, and a nice touch I've always liked about the Gladiator is that the third brake light is right there in the middle of the tailgate rather than up there with the cab. The reason of course being the cab is not permanent. The changes to the rear end weren't quite as drastic. Obviously we have a tweaked suspension back here as well. 2.5-inch dual reservoir dampers right back there. Both axles feature 4.1:1 ratios, and both axles are live axles, which is kind of an interesting twist for a desert-focused vehicle. A lot of desert vehicles have gone to independent front suspensions for a variety of different reasons. But Jeep has decided to keep the live axle here because they wanted to make sure that this could still tackle some more traditional off-roading duties while also being very focused on dune running. Whether this is the ultimate Baja pickup truck or not remains to be seen, but for the moment at least, this is the only one that will do the Baja with no windows, no roof, and no doors right from the factory. Speaking of doors and roofs, you'll notice that I have the front section of the roof off, but the rear of this hardtop is still in place. That's because it is a bear to remove. It does take quite some time. And it took me, and I've done this before, about 25 minutes to remove all 4 doors and the roof panels here. That does take some time. The other thing to know is, obviously, if you're going to be doing this for a weekend away from home, you're going to want to go somewhere where it doesn't matter that the car has no doors, because there isn't really a good place to put the doors in the bed as you're driving around. I suppose you could buy some aftermarket racks for that. So this really is take off the doors, go do your weekend thing, come back home, put the doors on, spend about an hour overall removing and then reinstalling the components. That's why I suspect a lot of folks out there will either just leave the doors off if this is a weekend vehicle or a really focused vehicle for playtime, or they're just going to leave them on all the time. And that's also why I have to say that I prefer some of the soft top options, not just on the Gladiator, but on the Wrangler as well, because they're more likely to be used. Under the hood, which incidentally requires no interior release still, just these latches on either side, we find just one engine. It's the 3.6-liter V6 engine out of the rest of the Gladiator lineup. Jeep tells us that this V6 engine was more appropriate for a desert-focused vehicle than the 2-liter turbo or the 3-liter EcoDiesel. You can get a 6-speed manual or an 8-speed automatic transmission. The 8-speed's the one that we find in this model, and it's definitely the transmission that I would select. Two main reasons for that are that the automatic transmission still gives us about the same kind of fuel economy, 19 miles per gallon combined for this model. It's easier in daily driving, and if I really needed to get out of a jam, I would much rather have a torque converter behind me than dealing with a clutch. But that's just my preference. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. As you'd expect, four-wheel drive is standard, but we don't get the same transfer case as the Rubicon. This shares the transfer case with the rest of the Gladiator lineup, giving us a 2.7-to-1 low ratio. The reason for that is high-speed operation. You can go an awful lot faster in 4-low in the Mojave with a 2.7-to-1 ratio than you could in a Rubicon with a 4-to-1 ratio. Another interesting twist is the rear locker. It will work in 4-high and 4-low in this model, where it's restricted to just 4-low operation in the Rubicon. Now, Jeep giveth and Jeep taketh away. We don't have the sway bar disconnect in this vehicle like we do find in the Rubicon, and we don't have a front locker available, just the rear locker. Now let's talk about the numbers. 0 to 60 happened in exactly the same time as the last Gladiator that we tested. I have to admit that surprised me a little bit because I figured with the different ratios involved here, especially the 33-inch tires, that the 0 to 60 time would be a little bit slower. But oddly enough, it was exactly the same. Now, stopping distance was a little bit longer, 139 feet from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That's mainly because of the tires. We see a similar increase in something like the Ford Raptor compared to the regular F-150. Off-road focused tires like this just don't seem to grip pavement quite as well. The off-road tires, which are definitely fun even out on a trail like this, are part of why I'm going to give this a C- when it comes to overall handling. Remember that the handling score up there is on-road handling, and the tire choice and suspension design definitely have an impact on on-road handling. As I said before, obviously the trails that we're on here are not ones that were designed for the Gladiator Mojave. Theoretically, this would be more like the regular Gladiator, or perhaps in some areas, the Gladiator Rubicon. But this is still the kind of trail you can certainly have an awful lot of fun on, and I have to admit that I like the 2.73-to-1 transfer case a little bit better for this application than the 4-to-1 transfer case that we see in the Rubicon. Just a little bit more appropriate for this kind of trail here. In 4-low, we're going 17 miles an hour and we're already in 6th gear. So just imagine if we had an even lower ratio, we'd be in 7th or 8th gear. Speaking of ratios, I like the fact that we have a manual mode here, not a sport mode or some sort of gear limit or gear suggestion. It allows us to vary the speed of the vehicle a little bit more easily. We also have Jeep's progress control system they call Select Speed. It allows us to choose between a low of 0.6 miles an hour, that's the slowest crawl speed there, and I can toggle it using the shifter all the way on up there to 5 miles an hour. That's a decent clip to be going down a hill, and then it manages everything for you. It's worth noting that this is significantly smoother than the progress control or hill descent control systems that we see available in Toyota's product line. The one mode we haven't talked about yet is this Off-Road Plus button right here in the center console. That gears all the systems for desert duty. So it coordinates the traction control, the stability control system, the transmission, the engine, etc. for the optimum in desert travel and desert traction. Now I have to say that because Off-Road Plus is so desert focused, I'm a little bit surprised they didn't call it desert mode. I've gone ahead and popped it back into 4-high because for this trail, 4-high is good enough. We don't need that extra braking. We can definitely scoot things down to 1st gear, for instance, if I needed to help control speed. And it does make for a quieter experience in the cabin, of course. Even though this suspension wasn't designed for this kind of trail, I have to say it does a good job of keeping all of the various suspension inputs in check. I wouldn't exactly call the ride overly plush, but it's not firm either. It is a good balance for off-roading. And then of course there's the kind of off-roading that this suspension was designed for. When it comes to cabin noise, well, obviously with the doors off, it is going to be louder in here than some of the competition, but also due to the general design, it's louder in here whether you have the top on or not. We do have the removable hard top here that is a little bit quieter than the soft top, but this is still going to be louder in the cabin at highway speeds than pretty much any of the other smaller trucks in America. As you'd expect out of a vehicle that is shaped sort of like a brick, fuel economy has been a little on the low side. We've been averaging 16 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. That's not far off what we see in other off-road focused trucks. In theory, if you were gentle on the throttle and you were driving this down the interstate, you could get maybe 22 on the highway. I have to say that there is something truly intoxicating about driving down the road without doors, without a roof, possibly even without a windshield, although I would probably need some aviator goggles for that. If you're looking for this kind of experience in your new pickup truck, there's really only one option. In my opinion, at the moment, there's just no comparison for the Gladiator in America. You could cross-shop this, I suppose, with something like a Toyota Tacoma TRD Pro or certain versions of the Chevy Colorado. Obviously, a Ford Raptor is going to be something along these lines, but none of them are going to be quite like this. The Raptor is obviously bigger. It's definitely wider. It also doesn't have doors that come off, a roof that comes off. It's not a convertible. You can't remove the windshield quite so easily. Now, again, it does take a lot of time to remove these components from the Gladiator and then put them back on, so definitely keep that in mind. But this is the only vehicle like this in America at the moment. And as a result, I would say either you want one or you don't. And if you want one, this is going to start just under $43,000 for the base model that is going to give you a manual transmission. The model that we've been driving today, which has pretty much all the options available on the Mojave, this came in just under $63,000. So this is fairly expensive for a mid-sized truck in America. This is notably more expensive than some of those very off-road focused entries that we find from General Motors or from Toyota. But again, it's not quite the same thing, and arguably one of the reasons that the Gladiator lineup starts so expensive to begin with is that they don't have a base on-road focused model, and that is one of the key things to keep in mind about the Gladiator, and especially this Mojave trim. This was not the most fun pickup truck to drive out on the open highway at 70 or 75 miles an hour. It wanders an awful lot. It definitely has a little bit of wobble going on there. It just has to do with the off-road nature and the specific off-road nature for this little desert-rated badge right there, because the regular Gladiator has a little bit of wandering feeling out on the open highway, but not quite like the Mojave. Tires and suspensions have a huge impact on the livability or daily drivability of a vehicle, and it's clear that this has taken some compromises in order to give it the very off-road desert-focused mission. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Hopefully I will be able to have the Mojave in its natural environment at some point. I just don't know exactly when that will be. I'll see all of you later.